Are the markets right? Is it not as bad as some people worry?
Well, it could. I mean, that's the thing, right, Mario, is that there's so much uncertainty that, nobody can make a definitive statement. So we're really talking about is probabilities. What are the probabilities that we end up in, say, a bad case? And what are the probabilities that we can avoid the bad case? And the very simple calculation here is the longer this goes, the probabilities shift unfavorably, right? The higher gasoline prices go in the US and diesel in Europe and jet fuel across Asia, the chances of the worst case or just bad cases just goes up and up and up. And by the way, the Trump administration obviously very well aware of it, which is why they seem to be rushing. What we don't know is that, there's a point of no return here. Just stepping back, looking at the big picture historical case, energy shocks precede recessions. And usually it's the combination of things, but, you have a relatively weak economy that's late in a cycle. Things are already moving in the wrong direction. Then, bam, oil costs go up probably sharply, and it's enough to tip everything over the edge. Pretty much everybody's well aware of the risk. So if you're a stock market investor, or at least you think you're a stock market investor, you look at some of the stock indexes anyway, it looks like what you just said. The stock market says, we've avoided that worst case. We haven't gotten to the tipping point. The probabilities are actually moving favorable because things are moving in the right direction on the geopolitical front. The U.S. administration, the U.S. and whoever it is over in Iran, they're going to make a deal. They'll get everything flowing again. That'll be great before all the damage gets done. However, even in the stock market, it isn't so cut and dried because yes, some of the various stock indexes are hitting new highs, but the breadth has been terrible, which means that a lot of stocks people aren't really buying. There's still a lot of nervousness even in the equity market that maybe
breadth means only a small percentage of stocks that are carrying the entire market. So it's not spread across the entire multiple industries and indices.
Yeah, so we get lazy, right? We say the stock market says everything is fine. But what are we really saying? What we're saying is, in this case, a very narrow slice of the stock market says everything is fine. And that's largely because people have moved on to AI and, maybe the technology for AI that's going to benefit. And there are going to be lots of winners and lots of upside there. But all the rest of the stock market is still kind of hung up a little bit. It's not all overly pessimistic, to be sure, but it isn't so rock solid, hey, we've moved past Iran. So even in the stock market, there's a significant amount of anxiety, let's call it, that maybe we still have to deal with some consequences here. And then you move into the other markets, which to me are vastly more important, especially when you're talking about discounting information. You look at something like forward rate markets. What does the forward rate market look like? Because that's basically pricing what interest rates are going to do, short-term interest rates are going to do in the near term and then further out. And if you would expect us to go into, to avoid the worst case in the economic consequences, avoid financial volatility, you would expect an upward sloping curve because that would be more normalized. And we're still seeing, well, it actually looks like a frown right now because the market expects central banks to raise rates a little bit in the short run. There's a chance that they do, including the Federal Reserve, but then have to cut rates after some indeterminate amount of time relatively soon into, maybe later this year, next year, which is not good scenarios. If the Fed, say, raises its rates by 25 basis points, thinking that oil prices are inflationary, which, by the way, they're not. If they make that same mistake that, Jean-Claude Trichet made in 2008, July of 2008, when the ECB raised rates in the middle of the Great Recession, they're very likely to have to turn around and lower rates as we get into the more unfavorable scenarios.
Oil prices going up is not inflationary?
Oil prices have a direct impact on consumer prices in the short run, but they're not inflationary in the sense that most people understand the term inflation, which is that prices outside of oil respond to oil, and it leads to a sustained acceleration in broad consumer prices, not narrow consumer prices. Again, this is one of the historical lessons from energy shocks. You get a shock in consumer prices driven by gasoline in the short run, but then over a period of time, as the economy takes the hit, demand falls off and prices of everything else other than oil start to collapse. And even oil prices eventually collapse once enough demand is destroyed. So what you see is a very short run spike in the consumer price index. And then almost as soon as it goes up, it goes right back down again.
Demand destruction. So people just start to travel less, to move around less.
Travel, or, look, you have less money to spend. I mean, right now, most consumers, they're spending an extra $100, $150 a month on gasoline. That's money that they can't spend anywhere else because the labor market is not robust. And if the labor market's not robust, they're not generating nearly enough income to absorb the higher energy costs, which means they have to pull spending back from someplace else. And it's not just consumers. Businesses that have already been pressured for several years now, seeing their margins erode, especially smaller, medium-sized businesses, seeing their margins erode, suddenly they get hit with a higher diesel cost bill. What are they going to do? They have to cut their costs someplace else because they're not seeing new business come in. So what do they cut their costs in? Well, I mean,
that's more recessionary. You think that would be more recessionary rather than inflationary? That's the real risk.
So that's what we're talking about here, about the unfavorable outcome. How much demand destruction takes place? Is it too much that leads into where businesses pull back too much to the point that they're not just cutting costs, they end up cutting workers. Then that leads to a higher degree of layoffs, a higher number of layoffs, higher unemployment. And suddenly what looked like it was going to be inflation to most people, especially central bankers, ends up being the historical recessionary case. So that's what we're trying to figure out. What is the balance of probabilities on both sides?
So what happens, let's use a few hypotheticals. What happens if oil hits $200, the number that everyone's been throwing around? And I know we're not there yet, but if we see a continuation of the war, if we look at a worst case scenario, I was on a show with one of the I think advisors to the negotiators in Iran earlier today, and he was very pessimistic on how things are going. He's like, Mario, the military buildup shows that war is almost inevitable, despite Trump seemingly wanting to walk away. So if we do see a continuation of the war and we see maybe the closure of the Strait of Hormuz for the rest of the year. I'm thinking really bad case scenario. Yeah, what would that look like?
That would be catastrophic. I tend to agree with that analysis. I think this is a much longer affair, and I've said this from the very beginning. This is not going to be a 6-week thing. This is,
really?
Yeah, I think the Trump administration is in it for they're not going to back down until they get what they want. Now, we don't really know what they want. I mean, they've said basically we want the nuclear program erased. I think they probably want regime change and regime collapse in Iran. And I think they're managing expectations to try to keep the market from turning catastrophic in the short run.
Why do you think they want regime change? Is it to control the Strait of Hormuz for leverage over China?
I think this is all about China. It goes back to Cold War II. Yes. So, Panama Canal, Venezuela, Cuba, Greenland. This is not about Iran or Israel. It's about China. It's about countering. It's about putting yourself in a Cold War mindset, except the primary adversary is no longer the Soviet Union. It's now the Chinese. And the Chinese have taken a number of provocative steps already. I mean, we hear every other day there's some news story about the Chinese doing something inside the U.S., whether it's hacking some kind of system, buying farmland up next to U.S. military bases, especially where our bombers are located. I mean, a lot of provocative stuff. I think the Trump administration came into office and came into this the second Trump term saying, we've got to do something about China. We can no longer just sit here and do nothing. And that's where this done row doctrine came from. We start with defending the Western Hemisphere, but also sending a message to China, as well as all those who might be considering lining up with China to say, look, they can't protect you. We're going into a binary sort of world where it's, I hate to use the term because it's associated with the Bush administration, but it's us versus them kind of a thing. And Iran is a huge piece in that Cold War calculus. So toppling the Iranian regime would be a huge piece. There's all sorts of other benefits that go along with it. So I think the Trump administration has decided, at least that's what it looks like to me, whatever the short run consequences are, it's worth the long run gain if they can pull it off and execute it, which by the way is a huge if. There's no guarantee in any of that. So what are the short run consequences? You're right, Mario. If the Strait of Hormuz continues to be closed for much longer, I mean, oil prices are not that far from $200 as it is. The cash price of oil is like 130, 140. It's been as high as 150. That's already happened. Now, the reason most people don't see that is because the futures price of oil is down around $100 per barrel. And that has been heavily manipulated through administration tactics. Every time the futures price of oil starts to creep up, what happens? Trump will come out with a Truth Social that says,
Barack
ceasefire tomorrow.
Well,
yeah, or there's a big speech coming up in 2 days, and you don't want to be long oil in that case. So they have done a masterful job manipulating the futures price of oil. You got to tip your cap to them in that respect. They have kept the lid on the futures price of oil. However, economic reality is economic reality. It's cold, it's brutal. And the truth of the matter is there's so much oil that is being constrained, just an absolutely incomprehensible amount. It was the head of the International Energy Agency who said this is 1973, 1979, and 2022 combined. So the reason why it doesn't feel
2022, 1979, and what?
1973. So all three of the major energy shocks of my lifetime combined. That's the amount of oil that's being constrained through Hormuz. The reason it doesn't feel that way is because, first of all, the futures price of oil has largely been manipulated and stable. So it doesn't look like it's all that. I mean, WTI is well below where it was in 2022. It doesn't look all that bad. And the other thing is the system does have some margin to absorb. We've got inventories that are floating around because remember, we were talking about a supply glut globally before we started with the Iran conflict. So there's oil inventories out there. They've been able to work around the bottleneck in the Strait to a certain extent. The strategic reserves have helped a little bit, but the capacity to absorb that level of shock is running dry and it's getting closer and closer to ending, which means as successful as they've been in manipulating the future price of oil, it's going to start to converge with the cash price. Like I said, the cash price is already astronomically high to begin with. And so we've already seen
cash price is essentially what anyone buying oil, what they pay for it now on the market. So if you're a country and want to buy some of the barrels of oil floating around, that's how much cash you pay right now.
That's what you would pay right now for a specific cargo that's leaving in a specific place for a specific grade of oil. So what is the cash price?
There's a name for it, isn't it? There's like a name for it in the market, like something crude. I remember.
The thing is, there is no single oil price. The one that people have been throwing around is called dated Brent, which is sort of So there are lots of different prices of oil, and usually it doesn't matter because they're usually relatively in the same range. But in this case, they've diverged historically, historic fashion, so that the cash price is ridiculously high. So what happens is over time, these real economic fundamentals have to converge with reality. So as much as Trump has been successful manipulating the futures price, gasoline, we've seen this rise in the United States. Wholesale gasoline, which is still a futures price, but wholesale gasoline on April 17th was $3 per gallon. And $3 per gallon roughly translates into a retail price of around $4 to $4.25. So already not good. $4 gasoline, not good. But the futures price of gasoline, which is called RBOB, went from $3 a gallon to as high as $3.75 in just a couple of weeks. As the gasoline market is, first of all, inventories have dropped precipitously because a lot of fuel is being shipped off to Asia, where it's really in short supply, but also because the cash price is that economic reality starting to exert itself in the futures market. So you get a futures price of gasoline in the United States of $3.75. That's $5 per gallon U.S. retail gasoline. Nationwide average, not just in California or Oregon, nationwide average of $5 gasoline. That's where we are right now. If nothing changes, if absolutely nothing changes, we're on track for $5 per gallon gasoline.
Politically, that would be horrible for Trump, and from a political perspective as well for the midterms.
Yeah, so I honestly think the Trump administration has probably correctly said the midterms are lost cause. So if we think the Iran conflict is worth the end goal, we'll sacrifice the midterms, maybe even the economy along the way. And it's maybe in some respects it's hard to argue with that calculus because Iran having a nuclear weapon is the very definition of catastrophe. So if that's really the case, then I think they have said, look, we're going to sacrifice the short run.
But the China argument makes a lot more sense than the nuclear weapons argument. I think Iran has shown through the JCPOA, through the Oman negotiations, that they're willing to give up their nuclear ambitions as long as they get some economic relief as well, some of the sanctions lifted. That's been a pretty clear position on their front. That's why, for me, the nuclear argument doesn't make sense. And generally speaking, almost every single war, whatever reason is given to the public, is not the real reason for the war. Exactly, it's one that makes the most political sense. I think the argument
that's what makes this analysis more difficult because we don't know. We always have perfect information.
Why did they attack Iraq? Very briefly, what do you think it is? What happened? What led to the Iraq war? Because I think economics probably plays the biggest role in dictating politics.
I think in this case, the Bush administration said, we're going to have a war with Islamic terrorists. It's better to have it over there than over here. And so they just picked a spot on the map and said, let's fight them in Iraq. I think that's what—
You don't think it was about oil?
No, I don't think it was about oil. I think there was no reason to fight for oil back then. Yes, oil prices had risen from the late 1990s. You can argue that it contributed to the dot-com recession in 2001, but I think it was really about 9/11. Honestly, I think that what the Bush administration said in all wars, the side that picks where you fight more often has the biggest advantage.
I think if that's the case, then he would have been misled, because that one just doesn't make sense if it's about fighting extremism. Okay, but then let's bring it to the scenario here, the war against China. The war against Iran.
Hopefully not.
So it is all about China. The war. It is
Yeah.
about the indirect war, the Cold War with China. That's it, because I've been saying, so I made a post that went viral making that exact point, that everyone's talking about Israel nuclear program. Look, guys, I really think it's about China controlling the energy choke points around the world, because China has rare earth. We need to have something, or the West needs something, or the US needs something to kind of counter that leverage card that China has. And now, I've also been saying, and those things contradict one another. I've been saying that the war is, since early April, I've been saying the war is about to end. And since the ceasefire, I've said, guys, it's over. There is no way Trump can continue this war. But then this clashes with what I've been saying. If it is about China, then this is worth losing the midterms from a strategic long-term perspective.
So what worries me, Mario, is that what worries me the most is that, there seems to be a little bit of urgency here, because the Trump administration went from one to the next to the next to the next, almost in rapid sequence, right? And there's a strategy here. This is not willy-nilly. This is not something they just dreamed up overnight and said, oh, we're going to go attack Venezuela. There is definitely a strategy here that's being carried out. What worries me is that the Trump administration is responding to specific threats, whether that be about China attacking Taiwan or something closer to home. I don't know, just speculating, but it seems like there is a high degree of urgency in moving from one to the next to the next. And as the administration officials have indicated, as soon as they wrap up in Iran, it looks like they're going to be starting with Cuba. It's one after another after another. And I think it comes down to, economics is part of it, but I think it's just pure power politics, right? It's sending a message to basically the rest of the world that, we are realigning the planet in a lot of different ways. And if you were thinking of aligning with China, look what happened to Maduro. Look what happened to maybe what the regime in Cuba. Look what happened to Iran, which, Iran and China were supposed to be really tight. The Chinese can't really protect you, and you either get with the program or you don't get with the program. That seems to me the overarching strategy here is to realign everything. Perfect example, the UAE leaving OPEC. Now, the UAE has been been talking about leaving OPEC for quite some time. But they've always been kind of on the fence. And in the grand scheme of things, OPEC's importance is diminished to begin with. But that also goes along what we're talking about here, realigning for the the rest of the 21st century. It's essentially taking the old leftovers from the 20th century and chipping away at them and redrawing the lines on the map to something else. And the UAE is an important symbolic shift in that direction. They're pulling out of OPEC. They're aligning themselves even closer to the United States, which is a symbolic move in that direction, because I think it fits the overall political strategy here.
That is really interesting. The bringing the UAE into this, because a lot of people are talking about countries realigning away from the US, because the US dragged the Gulf into this war unnecessarily. The US bases are seen as a liability. Some countries might question the alliance with the US because they've been thrown into the war, the Gulf. Asia suffering because of the war. Europe to a lesser extent into a war that the US decided to unilaterally launch. But you're making the argument that, guys, they might be pissed off, but there's also the argument that they have no choice, and the UAE is an indicator of that. Despite the UAE being attacked more than any other country, what they've done is they've doubled down on that American partnership. So that kind of could be an indicator of what's to come, is that we might see a realignment towards the US rather than the opposite, because the US is more aggressive militarily.
Or at least the US is acting in a way that actually benefits them, even if it isn't apparent right now. I mean, the UAE probably knows this more than anybody. Like you said, they're the ones that have been attacked primarily, even more than Israel. At least that's the intelligence that we have, which suggests that who is Iran more pissed off at? Who is the real enemies in the Middle East, or where are the actual fault lines in the Middle East? You think where they are, but I think what Trump is doing is chipping away at some of those old assumptions and trying to create new ones within this overarching strategy, which is to realign the world, U.S. versus China for the future. And it's because it's not one thing or another. It's all these different things. Venezuela is a perfect example. They went into Venezuela. Sure, there's symbolic value to it. Like, the Chinese were there the same day, right, that the raid was launched.
Crazy, yeah.
And then what happened to the oil? all of a sudden Trump says, this oil, it's under American protection. And it's not just Venezuelan oil that can be used in the United States or to be traded around the rest of the world. That oil was collateral for loans that the Chinese made to Venezuela. Now the Chinese have made loans that are now uncollateralized, or the collateral is now in the hands of the United States. That was not an accident. That was another little piece, little bit nugget that went along with the overall strategy. So I think the message here, just to put this, step back in big picture terms, there is a lot more going on here than people seem to give it credit for. Than certainly those who say this is about Israel, 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 Israel. I think this is so much less about Israel than it is everything else, starting with China.
I agree with that point. It's good to speak to you, and you're explaining it much better than I can ever do. Okay. So then, what about how does Cuba fit into this?
Same thing. Look, I mean, the Chinese are heavily involved in Cuba. So taking out Cuba would be the same thing as taking out Venezuela. In Venezuela is just, Cuba is just the next logical step after Venezuela, because Venezuela was basically the economic lifeline to Cuba. So when they went into Venezuela, they also, pre-toppled the Cuban regime by doing so. I guess there's a strategy here. And the strategy is to fortify the Western hemisphere first and foremost, but also to project power within the hemisphere as well as without of the hemisphere that says, look, this is the way the world is going to be from here on. You better get on board with it, because this is the way the world is going to be from here on. So again,
it's like economic. So we're seeing a battle of economic warfare, which is what China uses, the Belt and Road Initiative, investments around the world, versus military might. So we're seeing a clash of these two systems. And obviously, militarily, that always beats economics. Economics only works as long as there's no wars and there's no warships on someone's coast. So that's like two different strategies clashing in the world.
Well, and the U.S. is also saying we can do it too, right? Because the U.S. had long been, we'll use our economic might to try to win over the rest of the world and redraw the lines to our favor. And kind of, not always, but, it always kind of reserved the military option as sort of a last case. At least that's, the idea. We're here, the Trump administration is featuring it front and center, saying, look, we're not afraid to use our military if we need to in order to achieve whatever these objectives are. So they're basically bringing out both fists. They had one fist behind their back the entire time. Now they're saying we're going to fight you with both. Which again brings me back to this worry that I have that there is some level of urgency in the Trump administration about some kind of specific threat that they were anticipating from China. Maybe it's a longer range thing, and they're just trying to get ahead of it and nip it in the bud before it goes too far.
But the threat is right there. It's just rare earth is a massive thing. It's a massive leverage card that China has. So that is a pretty big threat that could crush the entire American economy and military.
Right. Yeah, especially as we go forward here and things become even more dicey. Because I mean, economically speaking, you're seeing, frictions in supply chains where things don't move the way they used to be. So, I mean, in that situation, the Chinese could exert a lot more leverage using smaller pieces of their what's in their arsenal than they normally would. So I agree with you on that too. This is a multifaceted realignment. It's economic, it's financial, it's political, it's geopolitical. It's redrawing a lot of different lines and a lot of different maps, and
don't you worry it could go wrong?
2020.
Okay, continue. Sorry, continue. 2020.
I'm going to say a lot of this is, started in 2020 with the pandemic and response there. It's just, especially where it comes to the economy, people don't get that we never really recovered from 2020 and the pandemic. And that makes the Chinese never recovered. The Chinese economy is an utter and complete disaster that's getting worse all the time. There's this idea that the Chinese are winning everything, that the Chinese economy is robust and it's strong. It's absolute opposite. The Chinese are closer to a banking crisis than they are to some kind of robust economic boom. Their banks are riddled with real estate loans that are just non-performing would be the best categorization of them. They're probably non-accrual, if not worst. So the Chinese have a banking crisis on their hands. It's a slow burning sort of back burner banking crisis, but it's there nonetheless. The economy stumbled badly in the middle of last year. China has been in deflation for 3.5 years solid, almost solid, 12 straight quarters of deflationary GDP, which undercount the degree of difficulty they've had to begin with, which means they produce here, but they have demand for here. And the only way to get the two to balance is to cut prices, which is economically suicide. So China is in a very, very difficult spot economically. especially without the real estate bubble to support the rest of the economy as it was.
So
going
what the
forward.
US is, this whole strategy is trying to turn China into a Japan rather than turn China into a US.
China was never going to become a Western country. I think that was a mistake a lot of people made before 2008. Ever since Deng Xiaoping went on his southern tour in 1991, was 91 or 92? I think it was 91. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the Chinese realized to avoid becoming the Soviet Union, we've got to do something radical. What they did radical was to allow a limited form of capitalism to create the wealthy modern society that socialists have dreamed of ever since Karl Marx. And so they did that, and they were absolutely successful with it. But they were never going to commit to become a neoliberal Western style nation, like a lot of people thought they were doing. What they were doing was riding that wave of wealth to achieve the socialist dream. The problem is the socialist dream got interrupted in 2008, and it led to all sorts of problems and consequences thereafter. The Chinese were never going to become like the United States. They were using their limited phase of capitalism to try to finish off the socialist revolution, and it just got interrupted. So the Chinese have always been moving in the Chinese direction from the very start. That never changed, even in the 90s and 2000s. So I think it's a positive step that somebody in the West is finally starting to admit this, that the Chinese are doing what the Chinese are doing, not because they're going to join the global community of nations as we all hold hands and sing Kumbaya. They have strategic interests that very much clash with our own, and they always have. But it was just much easier to get along when they were doing their capitalism, their limited phase of capitalism, and there was lots of prosperity in the world, widespread prosperity in the 90s and 2000s. And then 2010s, everything changed. And some of these assumptions were laid bare, and that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the aftermath, especially after COVID and the pandemic.
Yeah. What was it? We dragged them, we accepted them into... my last guest said we originally accepted them into the WTO because of the Iraq War. We didn't want them to, in the UN, we didn't want them to revoke the declaration of war. So what the concession that was done by the US is allow China to join the WTO, for China to allow or to vote in the UN for the US to be able to launch a war in Iraq. So as one of my guests told me that earlier today. It's like how it's all connecting. That was one of the biggest mistakes the US could have made.
Yeah, and it wasn't like the Chinese were trying to join the Brotherhood. They were using that for their own specific purposes. They were saying, okay, look, you guys need us for something. You got to give us something in return. And what they got was a period of absolutely epic economic expansion. The problem is it just got interrupted before they could complete it, at least from the Chinese perspective, which leaves the Chinese in a very bad situation. Because how did China respond to the 2008 crisis? They responded by using the Keynesian textbook. They basically created the real estate bubble, because that's what the Keynesian textbook tells them to do. When you go into a period of serious economic uncertainty, I mean, it wasn't as bad in China as it was elsewhere in 2008. What in 2009 and 2010, really starting late 2008, the Chinese were first to do the economic stimulus. Essentially, they created a real estate bubble to try to create enough economic activity to absorb the shock that they were going to hit from the Great Recession and its aftermath. So they created this massive bubble thinking that the world would get back on track at some point, but it never did. So from 2012 onward, the Chinese have gotten a bigger and bigger real estate bubble with less and less economic activity to support it. Eventually, those two lines on the map eventually have to cross, and then you're in Japan territory. So what the Chinese have been wrestling with, they have this massive bubble, but no way to support it in real, sustainable economic growth. What are you going to do in that situation? Well, their solution was to use COVID to try to take the air out of the real estate bubble as slowly as possible. And what it really did is unleash a banking crisis. And they've been trying to manage that ever since then. So for the last 5 years in China, it's been real estate problem, real estate bust, as well as a slow motion banking crisis. So the Chinese are in big trouble.
If we link that to the Iran war, so based on what you're saying, China cannot afford to give the Strait of Hormuz, control of the Strait of Hormuz, to the US. So therefore, China needs Iran to be able to beat the US, to be able to deplete their munitions, exhaust them politically, financially, exhaust the world economy. So then,
or from the other perspective, China has to let the United States win without interfering too much to be able to go back to normal. Because the same rules apply to China as it does the rest of the world. If we're talking about a global energy shock and the Chinese economy is already in bad shape to begin with, there may be more of an economic and financial downside in China than there is, say, in the United States. So maybe China has an interest in staying on the sidelines rather than propping up Iran and basically kind of surrendering the Strait of Hormuz to Trump, assuming that Trump can get it away from the Iranians. That may be the strategy that the administration is using here, using the leverage of the weak Chinese economy and its inability to withstand a tremendous energy shock.
One could say the meeting between the first peace negotiations for Iran, phase one will be Trump and Xi meeting next week. That will be the first phase of the Iran negotiations.
That's the thing. Don't you think that's why Trump delayed the meeting? To me, that's one of the reasons why they delayed the meeting in the first place, because he wanted to go to Beijing from a period of strength, or from a position of strength, and say, look, I've got you guys over a barrel here. I've got you by the balls, is what I really have here. So we're going to negotiate. I mean, that's what Trump is. Trump is a negotiator. He's a deal maker. He understands negotiating from a position of strength. Whatever you think about the guy, that's how he operates. So I think that's the strategy from the U.S. as it relates to China, to leverage the energy crisis, as bad as it is in the United States and especially Europe and the rest of the world, Africa. We talk about food shortage probabilities. So there's lots of negative consequences, but the upside is to negotiate the Chinese, whatever it is that's on his mind and on his agenda, from a position of strength.